Okay, my name is Brooke Henderson. Is the volume good for everybody? Okay. My name is Brooke Henderson. I work for Synagro. We are a Biosolids Management contractor, and I'm going to talk to you today about biosolids. I know you had a little discussion earlier from Allison from MDE talking about the regulations surrounding biosolids. I will briefly touch on that in terms of how it affects how we use them, but I won't really focus on the regulations so much because I know you've already had that information. Biosolids are the organic solids, primarily organic solids, that are produced following treatment of wastewater at a wastewater treatment facility. By definition, if they are termed biosolids, that means they have also already been tested and found to be safe for recycling on the land as a fertilizer. And there's a number of quality characteristics that I will touch on a little bit later in the presentation that mean that they can be considered safe. This is just an aerial shot of, actually fairly outdated aerial shot of one of the country's largest wastewater treatment plants, which is actually serves the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area. And in terms of the actual processes that happen at the wastewater treatment plant, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a history on water pollution, the Clean Water Act, which I doubt Allison discussed much. But the Clean Water Act of '78 that actually predates all of the biosolids regulations, both federal and state, that we currently operate under. And what that started with was a concern about water quality in the U.S. and trying to make sure that we weren't dumping things into water that were damaging to water quality, but also looking at the things that were being dumped to see if they could be handled in a way that was not only not damaging, but also could possibly be beneficial. And one of the materials that was determined that met that criteria was biosolids, which fertilizer in putting it in water is obviously not good for the water quality, but it is good if it's managed properly on land, as you all know. With that in mind, they, in terms of looking at better managing the materials that were coming out of wastewater treatment plants, they first looked at what went into the wastewater treatment plant. And actually, any kind of commercial entity in the whole United States has a type of discharge permit that they, with a set of criteria and with testing and monitoring requirements, that determine what they can and cannot discharge into the public sewer system. And that would apply for, factories that you might consider could be like electroplating facilities or leather tanneries have sort of been singled out as commercial entities that can discharge really polluting materials to a wastewater treatment plant. They are regulated and monitored by discharge permits that are typically issued by the wastewater treatment facility themselves, that are linked also to regulatory agencies within that state, and that are now also linked to some degree to the federal standards for the National Pollutant Discharge System. Because it all what gets discharged from wastewater treatment plants, both in terms of biosolids and what's called effluent, which is the clean water that comes out of the plant, it all starts with what goes in to begin with. So there was the regulation, that was an outgrowth of the Clean Water Act that began to look at what was going into the wastewater treatment plant. There's a set of criteria, primary, secondary, and advanced treatment for the material once it actually gets in there, and the sewage sludge itself for the biosolids happens a little bit later on in the process, and I'll talk on that some more. These are what are the most common forms of stabilization processes that occur to the sewage sludge. This is after the wastewater has already been through its primary, secondary, and advanced treatment. These are the most common used in the U.S., and out of these, in Maryland, The most common is the third one, lime stabilized, which is a consideration in terms of using biosolids. I'll get into some specifics about that shortly. And then second most common would be the aerobic digestion. I'm going to call your attention to the digestion. Let's see. Okay. I'm going to call your attention to digestion for just a moment here. And just circling back to my point, my opening point about regulating what's going into the wastewater treatment plants. One thing that's important to consider in terms of using the material is wastewater treatment plants are actually living systems. And I'm going to flick back to that photograph of the wastewater treatment plant in D.C. These circles that you see are huge tanks that are holding wastewater. In those tanks are bacteria, microbes, that are put there by the wastewater treatment plant operators. And basically what happens at a wastewater plant is the same thing as what happens in nature, but it's just being engineered in such a way that it can happen much more quickly. And that is for these microbes to consume and digest the wastes that are coming in the wastewater. And as they consume and digest them and excrete them, then the forms of those wastes are changed. And that is what actually ends up in time cleaning the wastewater that comes in, removing the pollutants from the water. And then what you have happen with the microbes is they settle out. They are solid in the water column, and they settle out after they die. They have a simple life form. They have a fairly short lifespan, about a month or so. And they settle out, and it is those solids, those dead microbes, literally, that comprise the biosolids that we then stabilize using one of those methods that I showed you, the digestion or the lime stabilization, stabilized at the wastewater treatment plant, tested, and then spread on land. And that's why the digestion process is important. Now, usually, even if a biosolid meets the standard for recycling for pathogen reduction through lime stabilization, there's a digestion process prior to that occurs as a part of cleaning the water, because that's the main purpose of the wastewater treatment plant, that they discharge clean water, take in dirty water and discharge clean water. These are some other stabilization processes that are used for what's called Class A pathogen stabilization. There's two classes that I'm sure Allison mentioned, Class B and Class A. Class A is pretty much pasteurized or sterilized, as Dr. Steinhilber was saying earlier, through various methods. Class B is not 100% pathogen reduction. It's more like 95% or so. And I'll get into some of the considerations in terms of that in a moment as well. So because the biosolids are primarily comprised of the microbes, they're typically about 70% organic matter, dead microbes. So that is one aspect that is interesting to a lot of farmers, as well as the fertilizer value. In terms of applying biosolids, we're balancing a number of different criteria, both to utilize and recycle the material, but to do it in a way that is safe for both the public, for water quality, and also for farm animals and wildlife as well as another consideration. Biosolids provide a number of benefits. I mentioned the organic matter earlier. And I also mentioned that a lot of the biosolids in the Maryland area are lime stabilized, which means lime is added to the material following the digestion process, and the purpose of adding the lime is to kill pathogens. Biosolids also typically contain high amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus and some micronutrients. Typically, biosolids have virtually no potassium value. So that's another consideration. In terms of the benefits and risks that biosolids provide, these are a number of the benefits here. If you have a low soil pH, the lime is a benefit. The organic matter is pretty much beneficial at any point in time. Nitrogen is typically beneficial. Phosphorus, once again, it depends on your phosphorus site index, whether that's going to be something you actually need or not. In terms of the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus, because almost all the nitrogen when the biosolids are first applied are in the ammonia, the organic form of nitrogen, so the breakdown by the microbes is determined, a lot of you know this, by the soil temperature. So it's a slower process, a slower release. It therefore can be safer for the water quality, nearby water, surface waters and groundwater, and also more closely parallels the use by the crop. Phosphorus, the limit, that is less quickly released than a lot of other forms, purely because of the chemicals that are added to the wastewater as a part of the wastewater treatment. They tend to bind up the phosphorus from the biosolids, and it takes a longer period of time to release that, if at all. Some of it basically just stays bound up from the treatment during the wastewater treatment process. So with the fertilizer value, of course, there's a money savings to the farmer. There's no charge for the biosolids. As a contractor, our costs are covered by usually the municipality or the generator at the wastewater treatment plant. They pay us, and we basically sort of act as a middleman in terms of finding a farmer who might be interested in the material. So those are primarily the benefits. Now, in terms of risks or negative aspects of it, touching first on the lime, if you have a sandy soil and you have a high pH or pH at a 6.5 or a little bit higher than that, you're probably already in the optimum range for your soil pH in terms of most crops that might be grown around here. We now have a form that we require, and also MDE administers that, to ensure that on the sandier soils, the coastal plain soils in Maryland, that pH has to be taken as a part of the soil analysis, so we verify that prior to applying any lime amended biosolids. The purpose being that you can get certain micronutrient deficiencies if the pH gets too high on those soils. And that can happen if you keep applying biosolids that already have a fair amount of lime in them. So that's verified now to ensure that that doesn't happen inadvertently. That could be one downside of a lime amended biosolid source. The other downsides are, as I mentioned, the farmers don't pay for the material in terms of, they don't pay any money for the material. They do pay a price in terms of convenience because, a farmer who is going to apply a fertilizer that he might get from the farm supply store can usually do that whenever he wants. He goes and buys it, or he contracts with somebody to come and spread it. But with us, because we typically have we're juggling a lot of different sources that we manage all over the state, and with different spreading crews that are operating all over the state, and obviously our operations are weather dependent. Therefore, probably usually the best we can say to somebody in terms of when we're going to come and do their farm is, we're going to try to get to you the first 2 weeks of April, last 2 weeks of April. And then if something happens weather-wise that we get delayed, and we might get there 2 weeks later, or something might happen where we get delayed and we might just say, look, we thought we were going to be able to get to you this year, but we're not going to. We're going to have to move our equipment over to the other side of the state for some reason. So there's definitely lots of convenience to the farmer in terms of that. We do the best we can to try to meet farmers' planning schedules. Obviously, if we don't have farms to operate on, we don't have a business. So we do the best we can, but inevitably there's somebody who's not getting quite what they had hoped for. So that is a cost, so to speak, to the farmer. And then the other things, I mentioned that there's no potassium in the biosolids. As a part of the program, because it's a regulated program, when a farmer signs a consent form, they agree to allowing state regulators, sometimes local health departments, to inspect and access their farm. Not everybody's comfortable with that. And then the other things would be issues related to your neighbors or the farmer's neighbors if they have concerns about the use or whatever else the farmer might be doing on the farm. He might already have neighbors who are scrutinizing his activity. Sometimes that can be addressed amicably. Sometimes that's an individual decision for the farmer. Odor can be an issue at times, and then the trucks that bring the material. You'll have truck traffic on your field to bring the material. I'll have some pictures later in the presentation. We try to spread the material in places that are, or try to have the trucks access the fields and deposit the material in places that will cause the least damage, but you can get some compaction. And that can sometimes only to some degree be managed by disking of the soil afterwards. So this is typical. I know this is an outdated slide, but honestly, apart from the spike that we had, I guess, about a year and a half ago with fuel prices going up, this is really still typically pretty close in terms of what an average biosolids application provides in terms of dollar value to the farmer. The highest value, of course, being the nitrogen. The spreading and tillage cost is pretty valuable. I'm not sure if that number is quite up to date, but it does seem as though we calculate this about every year or so. We still seem to keep coming in the $120 per value per acre value. And this slide touches on the soil pH issue that I talked about in terms of being careful about what the soil pH ends up to be. I have a series of application slides here. This one is showing you you can see the truck here in the background. Right here, this is a tractor trailer vehicle is typically what manages what we call cake biosolids. It's sort of a weird name. I don't know who called it cake, but it looks a lot like manure or mud. It's usually cake is about 25–35% solid. And the remainder is actually water, although it doesn't look like that 75% water. It has to do with once again, the chemicals that are added as a part of the wastewater treatment process. They add something called polymer, which tends to aggregate things together. And so although that is 70% water, you would see no water running off that. It's all bound up, and it breaks down over time after spreading. So a lot of times people are concerned and saying, oh, you're taking 100 trucks on that farm. Well, about 70 of those trucks, if you could break it down, 70 of those trucks out of 100 were moving water, and about 30 were moving the fertilizer organic matter that is the reason the farmer's getting the biosolids. And that's even more so with a liquid form of biosolids. But anyway, this is showing you a fairly typical operation where you've got a tractor trailer truck that's actually on the application field, deposited the load of biosolids you see over on the right. Then you've got a front-end loader loading a spreading box that's being pulled behind that tractor. We calibrate the spreading equipment to ensure that our application rates are consistent. I know Allison Morong indicated that we have application rates are determined by permits. The permits are issued in conjunction with a nutrient management plan that we provide to MDE and that they review, so that the operators, the equipment spreaders know, given certain sources, because each source would have a different nutrient concentration, and it's all tested to ensure, given certain source that is being spread, that the material is going on at the specific rate for that source on that field by adjusting. And then oftentimes if it's a crop, we are disking following application. And then the following pictures, this is for liquid biosolids. Now the material that's transported in these tanker trucks is usually only about 10% solid, so that's 90% water. There's really only one major generator in the state that is still has a lot of plants that produce the liquid material. The reason for that is cost, because they pay by how much material we move, because with every truck, of course, there's costs associated with that. So we have to consider the total volume we're moving. So So they're paying, but we're moving 90% water in a truck like this. So actually this generator is in the process of switching over to a drier material. So the nice part about a liquid operation is everything, unless it's being spread on the surface, which is not typical, everything is contained. It's in a tanker truck. It gets transferred from the tanker truck to, this is a interrogator. It gets transferred to the hose, through the hose to the interrogator, and then it gets applied with these chisels in the back of the gator. It gets injected under the surface of the ground, and so basically everything's contained. So you pretty much never have an odor issue with a liquid operation. So that's a plus. And so we're sorry, in some ways, we're sorry to see that go. Now the downside to a liquid operation is the material is in those 5 trenches. And even because they typically go fairly deep, and we can adjust the depth, but even so, you don't get the even application that you get with a surface application. So, so there's pros and cons to that as well. Okay. See what we have here. This just gives you some examples of variations depending on different sources. These are some sources that contracts that some that we currently still have, or that we have periodically over time. The contracts for spreading and managing the material, it's a competitive bid process. We're the largest land applier, biosolids contractor in the area, but there are still others that do it as well. And so, you know, there are periods of time when we may or may not have an individual source available. But this just gives you, and that doesn't really impact the farmers or you guys, but it does. It just shows you the consideration in terms of, you know, calculating the percent solids in the material. You can see some, you know, fairly distinct differences in terms of, you know, the fertilizer value and the percent solids, and that all has to be considered in the nutrient management. And then this slide, actually this slide gives you an idea of the biosolids in comparison to manure, something you may be more familiar with, kind of typical value, fertilizer value compared to manures. The nutrient management plan, the folks that we have who make the farmer contact work with, come here to MDA just like you guys do to keep certifications current, and we submit those plans to MDE for evaluation along with our request for the permit. Permits themselves are good for 5 years. NMP is just the same as your situation. They are good for a year or until the biosolids are applied, whichever comes first. And you know, the criteria that we write them under is the same as what you guys are familiar with once again. The PAN, and I don't know if Allison, did she cover the no, okay. PAN means plant available nitrogen, and this is the equation that we use basically in terms of the nitrogen required, the need of the crop, minus anything residual. The residuals could come from manure, previous manure, biosolids, or legumes planted. Once again, that should be pretty similar to what you'd be doing for any of your materials. The PAN calculation itself that we do is here, and I'll back up to that other thing in a minute, but this is actually MDE's, what's in the MDE regulations that we have to follow as a regulated material. And then there's some consideration for loss to volatilization if it's a surface applied material, a liquid that's been surface applied. So basically this is the calculation that we would use to determine the plant available nitrogen for every single source that we would potentially apply. Now in terms of mineralization, once again, this is all written in the regulations. There's different mineralization rates depending upon the process that stabilized the biosolids, whether it's digested material, aerobic, anaerobic digestion, or lime stabilized, different factors in consideration for the mineralization rate. And that that all affects the ultimate amount that's land applied. And the year goes up to 10 years back. We have to calculate residuals for biosolids up to 10 years back. And in reality, there's probably really only much biosolids value left after about 3 years. Similar, I think, to most manures. But these show you how the way the material is stabilized, how that affects the mineralization factors that we apply in these calculations. And then just adding those years together to get the total amount available from biosolids applied in the past. So this is kind of the typical form we use, and then we take this information and merge it with, I guess, Newman, is that what it's called? So this might show for the different fields, field 1 through 4 here in this column, and the size of the field, the soil pH, P2O5, and phosphorus values from the soil index, and then the typical crops that are grown, what the yield goals are, and what the crop requirement is. And then over here you have the residual calculations from biosolids or legumes or manure, and then just subtracting out what's still there from a residual versus what's needed. 125 pounds of N less 19, 106 pounds of N is needed. And from that we get to a dry ton application rate, because as a part of calculating our applications, we need to calculate dry ton because we have to remove all that water. And so dry ton makes it comparing apples to apples rather than apples to oranges. For phosphorus management, I think once again you guys probably know all this. We follow the phosphorus site index. We do those when the phosphorus values on the soil test results indicate that that's necessary. Make adjustments to the application rate if possible, or just say we're going to have to wait another year before we spread this field. Sometimes it's not possible to reduce the amount of material that much, because for the most part we adjust, we make the adjustments in terms of how much we apply, for the most part just by the speed of the tractor. Spreading, to some degree, we can adjust the spreader box. In terms of places to go to get the information you'd need to do a nutrient management plan, MDE is your probably your one-stop shop. Sometimes they may not be able to get something to you in the time frame you need. In that case, if you speak to the farmer and find out who the contractor was that did the application before, we can provide you copies of the same information that we would have provided as a part of our reporting requirement to MDE. We keep all that stuff. We're required to for a number of years. So that's all available. I think I've covered everything on your goals. Did anybody have any questions? Anybody hungry?
That $130 saving was for what kind of crop did you calculate that for?
I think that's for corn.
Oh.
Yeah, corn, beans being the kind of the most typical that we do.
In your table for nutrient management plan recommendations,
yeah,
the yield goals that you had given was average per farm, or because I saw the same yield, and it could be when you apply in different management unit, they may have different yield goal and capability. What do you do with that?
Well, the nutrient management plan that I put on the presentation was just a general one, but what we would do is we would look at each field individually, the soil type and everything in terms of calculating the soil type, the method that the farmer uses, in terms of his planting, and we would just take a look at all of that in terms of coming up with specific yield goals. We don't say 125 for everybody, not at all. That's your answer.